the creatures that lived before the dinosaurs. Long before the age of dinosaurs, Earth belonged to stranger things. Creatures with 5 eyes, jawless mouths, sail-like backs, and bodies so alien they defy comparison to anything alive today. This forgotten world stretched across hundreds of millions of years of time when life was still experimenting with form, function, and survival. Some of these animals ruled the seas with clawed tentacles. Others crawled through swamp forests or clung to microbial mats on the ocean floor. Most left behind only fragments, a fossil here, a trace there. But from those pieces, a picture emerges filled with predators, survivors, and evolutionary dead ends. These weren't just precursors to dinosaurs. They were the first to dominate, adapt, and sometimes vanish without explanation. Step into this ancient chapter of Earth's history and meet the creatures that once ruled a very different world. Dickinsonia, one of the earliest complex life forms. It didn't look like an animal, not in the way we think of animals today. It had no eyes, no mouth, no bones, and no legs. Just a flattened, oval-shaped body marked by evenly spaced rib-like segments pressed into the seafloor more than 500 million years ago. And yet, Dickinsonia was alive, possibly one of the first truly complex creatures to ever exist, drifting through an Earth that bore almost no resemblance to the world we now know. Long before the first fins sliced through ocean currents or the earliest jaws snapped shut on prey, there was a time when the seas were still filled with mystery. The Ediacaran period, stretching back roughly 570 to 540 million years ago, was a slow and quiet chapter in Earth's history, populated not by hunters or herds, but by soft-bodied organisms that left few traces behind. Dickinsonia is one of the rare exceptions. Its fossils, first unearthed in the Ediacara Hills of South Australia in the 1940s, preserved its shape in such clear detail that scientists were left both fascinated and puzzled. It didn't resemble any living creature. For decades, no one could say whether it was an animal, a plant, or something else entirely. What set Dickinsonia apart wasn't its size or speed, but its structure. The body showed bilateral symmetry, a mirrored left and right side divided by a faint central axis, an early hint of organization that would later define entire branches of animal life. While most fossils measured only a few centimeters, some stretched to nearly 1.4 meters in length, making it one of the largest known organisms of its time. And for a world that had yet to produce predators or skeletons, that size meant something. It meant evolution was beginning to experiment with form. Its lifestyle, though still unclear, is slowly being pieced together. Dickinsonia likely lay flat against microbial mats on the shallow seafloor, absorbing nutrients directly through its lower surface. In some rare fossils, researchers have found subtle feeding traces, shallow grooves, that suggest it slowly crept along, leaving behind the faintest signature of movement. There were no footprints, no bones to mark its path, just imprints in the sediment, as delicate and fleeting as a breeze across wet sand. For many years, one of the central questions surrounding Dickinsonia was whether it was even an animal at all. It lacked obvious organs, and its method of feeding didn't align with modern creatures. But in 2018, a team of scientists made a surprising breakthrough. They discovered preserved molecules of cholesterol in a fossilized specimen from Russia's White Sea region, an unmistakable biomarker associated with animals. The fossil, remarkably well preserved in sandstone, dated back over 558 million years, making it the oldest confirmed animal fossil ever identified. That single clue pushed Dickinsonia across a blurred biological boundary, confirming that it was not a fungus or a microbial colony, but one of the earliest animals known to science. Even now, its classification remains uncertain. Some researchers suggest it belonged to an extinct group of animals, unlike anything alive today. Others see it as a primitive relative of modern worms or jellyfish. What's clear is that Dickinsonia existed in a world before complexity truly took off, before skeletons hardened, before limbs developed joints, and long before eyes learned to recognize shape and motion. Its environment would have seemed alien to us. The ocean floor was covered in vast bacterial mats, with few creatures stirring above them. The water itself lacked oxygen in many regions, and the air, if you could have called it, that contained little of what we now breathe. Life clung to the shallows, where sunlight could still reach, and where simple forms like Dickinsonia could thrive. It was a world in slow motion, where change came not in bursts, but in quiet shifts over millions of years. The fossil record of Dickinsonia doesn't tell us everything, but it offers something rare, a clear, physical record of a creature that lived and moved during a time when most life left nothing behind. Its soft body, pressed into stone, is a reminder that even in Earth's most ancient past, the story of animals had already begun to take shape, not with violence or speed, but with quiet, persistent presence. And in that presence, we see the outline of everything to come. The rise of the trilobites. They came in countless shapes and sizes, from tiny coin-sized crawlers to palm-length giants armored like tanks. For over 270 million years, trilobites scuttled across the seafloor, leaving behind more fossilized remains than almost any other creature from Earth's distant past. And though they've long vanished, the hardened impressions of their segmented bodies tell the story of an early animal group that once ruled the oceans with quiet dominance. Unlike the soft-bodied Dickinsonia that came before, trilobites were built to last. Their outer shells, made of a hard material called calcite, gave them natural protection and an advantage in fossilization. They had three main body parts: a head shield, a segmented thorax, and a tailplate, which gave them their name trilobite, or three-lobed. But beneath that simple pattern was an animal of surprising complexity. Some had spines along their backs. Others had smooth, oval bodies built for burrowing. A few even developed defensive horns or blade-like ridges, shaped by the pressures of a world growing more competitive. One of the most striking features of trilobites was their eyes. Made not of soft tissue, but of hardened crystal, specifically calcite lenses, these were among the first complex eyes on Earth. Some species had wide, crescent-shaped eyes with nearly panoramic vision, ideal for spotting predators or prey in the dim underwater light. Others, adapted for burrowing or deep-sea life, had reduced or even absent eyes. These differences weren't just random, they marked an explosion of variety, as trilobites adapted to almost every marine environment available to them. They first appeared over 520 million years ago, near the dawn of the Cambrian period, during a time known for rapid biological change. This period, often referred to as the Cambrian explosion, saw the emergence of many modern animal body plans. Trilobites were among the earliest arthropod creatures with jointed legs and exoskeletonsa group that would eventually give rise to insects, spiders, and crabs. But in their own time, trilobites had no rivals in their class. They were scavengers, predators, and survivors all at once. Fossils of trilobites have been found on every continent, even in places that are now dry and landlocked. From the Burgess Shale in Canada to the limestone beds of Morocco and the shale layers of China's Chengjiang site, their remains offer a vivid map of ancient seabeds. Some fossils are so detailed that they preserve the fine ridges of the exoskeleton, or the faint line where the trilobite molted and crawled out of its old shell. That ability to molt wasn't just for growth. It may have helped them survive injury or shed parasites clinging to their bodies. Their diversity was immense. Over 20,000 species have been described so far, ranging from flat-bodied bottom dwellers to more bulbous, streamlined swimmers. Some species evolved long spines that may have deterred predators or helped with stabilization in soft sediment. Others had smooth, hydrodynamic shapes for gliding across open water. Their many adaptations tell us they weren't just one successful design, they were an entire dynasty of sea creatures, each generation experimenting with new forms. That doesn't mean trilobites were immune to change. Over time, their numbers began to decline, especially after a series of extinction events that swept through the Paleozoic era. By the time the Great Permian extinction arrived around 252 million years ago, only a few trilobite lineages remained and none survived it. Still, the story they left behind is unusually rich. Because their skeletons fossilized so easily, they offer one of the clearest records of early animal evolution, not just in their form, but in the environments they lived in. Some trilobites had trace fossils associated with them feeding trails, burrow marks, or tracks pressed into the sediment. These allow scientists to reconstruct how they moved, what they ate, and how they interacted with their surroundings. And then there are the eyes against those tiny lenses of ancient crystal, some still catching the light under a modern microscope, revealing the presence of vision in a world that had barely begun to see. More than just ancient survivors, trilobites are compelling because they represent a visible break in the story of life. With them, the fossil record starts to show signs of behavior, adaptation, and competition traits that define modern ecosystems. In a way, they represent the first truly visible animals, preserved in rock across the planet like a memory the Earth couldn't quite let go of. Sea scorpions, the ocean's top predators. Sharks may seem like the ultimate ocean predator, but they relate to a game once dominated by something bizarre. With claws like curved blades and armored bodies built for attack, sea scorpions, also known as Eurypterids, dominated the waters as the planet's earliest apex predators. Some were no longer than a finger, but others stretched over 2 meters long, their segmented tails sweeping through the murky depths like prehistoric lances. They weren't true scorpions, though they shared the name. Instead, these creatures belonged to an extinct group of arthropods that once thrived across the world's shallow seas, estuaries, and even freshwater environments. Their closest modern relatives are spiders and horseshoe crabs, but none of those match the scale or fearsome presence of the largest Eurypterids. Fossils found in places like New York, Norway, and Scotland reveal long, paddle-like limbs for swimming, powerful grasping appendages at the front, and body plates that would have made them look like underwater tanks in slow motion. A species known as Jacalopterus rhenaniae holds the title for the largest known arthropod ever discovered. This monster, uncovered in what is now Germany, may have reached lengths of nearly 2.5 meters. That's longer than a grown man. Its fossilized claw alone measured over 46 centimeters, and when researchers first uncovered it in 2007, the find made headlines. It wasn't just its size that shocked scientists, it was the realization that creatures of that scale were patrolling ancient waters hundreds of millions of years ago, long before any vertebrate predator had evolved teeth. Their reign began in the Ordovician period, over 460 million years ago, and lasted until the end of the Permian, around 250 million years ago. In that time, sea scorpions adapted to all kinds of aquatic settings. Some lived in shallow lagoons where they likely ambushed prey from beneath the silt. Others were better swimmers, using their flattened, oar-like limbs to glide swiftly through the water in search of trilobites, early fish, and even each other. Evidence from fossil sites suggests that cannibalism was not uncommon. In contrast to other prehistoric animals, whose lives are mostly speculation, Eurypterids gave us something more concrete. Their fossils sometimes appear alongside trackway shallow drag marks or prints that show how they walked or swam across ancient mudflats. In a few rare cases, scientists have found entire preserved molts, the remains of their shed exoskeletons, which hint at growth patterns and life cycle stages. Some species even had jointed limbs capable of grasping, allowing them to seize and manipulate prey in a way few other invertebrates could match at the time. It's easy to imagine them as fierce, untouchable hunters, but not all sea scorpions were giants. Many were only a few inches long, crawling along the bottom in search of worms or soft-bodied animals. Their bodies came in all shapes, some wide and flattened, others narrow and finned. Over time, this variety exploded into more than 250 known species, each fine-tuned for a specific niche in the food web. That adaptability may have helped them survive multiple extinction events across the Paleozoic era. Still, their long rule eventually came to an end. As vertebrate fish became faster and better armed with jaws and armor, the sea scorpions began to fade from dominance. By the time the Permian extinction swept through the planet around 252 million years ago, the last of them disappeared for good. Yet for over 200 million years, they had been a force no creature could ignore, a reminder that before bones and teeth shaped the oceans, claws and carapaces held power. What they've left behind tells more than just a story of survival. The fine structure of their compound eyes, visible in some well-preserved fossils, suggests surprisingly advanced vision for their time. Their segmented tails, some ending in spines or paddles, hint at both defense and agility. And the spread of their fossils across ancient continents shows how widespread and successful they were during their prime. Today, the name sea scorpion might suggest something exotic or dangerous, but the truth is even more fascinating. These were the first true marine hunters to rise to power on Earth, a lineage of creatures that turned the ancient seas into hunting grounds, long before evolution gave rise to anything with a spine. The world they ruled has long vanished, but the impressions of their armor and claws still sit locked inside slabs of stone, waiting for us to recognize just how strange and powerful life once was. The mysteries of Hallucigenia. The creature seems stitched together from fragments of a dream with just enough nightmare to make it real. When paleontologists first uncovered fossils of Hallucigenia in the Burgess Shale of British Columbia, they struggled to understand what they were looking at. It had spiky spines on one side, a row of stubby legs on the other, and a body so alien that early reconstructions showed it upside down, with its spines mistakenly thought to be legs. Even its head was confused with its tail. For years, scientists weren't even sure which way it walked or how it lived. Few animals in the fossil record have caused as much confusion and debate. Hallucigenia lived over 500 million years ago during the Middle Cambrian period, a time when life was rapidly diversifying into new and bizarre forms. Its fossils are tiny, many only a few centimeters long, but the details preserved in those small remains opened a window into a world where life seemed to experiment with almost every possible shape. With 7 or 8 pairs of flexible limbs beneath its body and a row of defensive spines arching over its back, Hallucigenia looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. It took decades before scientists began to agree on which side was up. For a long time, reconstructions placed the spines on the bottom and the legs on top. It wasn't until the 1990s and early 2000s, with new technology and better preserved specimens, that researchers realized the mistake. More complete fossils from China's Chengjiang deposit helped clarify its anatomy, confirming that the soft, lobe-like limbs were used for walking, while the long, stiff spines served as protection. This flipped understanding changed not just how we viewed Hallucigenia, but how we understood its relatives. It wasn't just its body that puzzled experts, it was also its place in the tree of life. Early theories placed Hallucigenia as a completely unique organism, with no clear ties to modern animals. But over time, as more similar fossils were discovered, it began to look like Hallucigenia belonged to a group called Lobopodian, soft-bodied animals with legs, often considered early relatives of modern velvet worms. Some scientists even argue that Hallucigenia is a very early branch of panarthropods, the group that includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans. If that's true, then this strange little creature is one of the ancestors of nearly every bug and crawler we see today. Among all its oddities, the head of Hallucigenia caused the most debate. For years, scientists couldn't even agree where it was. The front and back ends looked so similar that researchers misidentified the orientation. It wasn't until 2015 that a team used scanning electron microscopy to examine the fine details of the fossil and identified a ring of tiny teeth and simple eyes near one end features that finally pointed to its true head. The mouth appeared to be surrounded by a throat lined with teeth, likely used to grip or filter soft food particles. This level of preservation was incredibly rare, and it brought new clarity to a creature that had seemed deliberately difficult to categorize. Despite the progress made, Hallucigenia remains deeply mysterious. We don't know exactly how it moved across the ocean floor, what it ate, or how it sensed its environment. It lacked hard armor or claws, suggesting it was more of a grazer than a predator. Its long, clawed limbs may have helped it climb or grip soft surfaces, while the spines along its back deterred larger creatures from attacking. Still, it's hard to picture exactly how it interacted with the other strange animals of its time, like Opabinia or Anomalocaris, which shared its ancient habitat. What makes Hallucigenia so fascinating isn't just its weirdness, it's the way it reminds us how little we know about early life. For all the fossils we've found, many more have been lost to time, and creatures like Hallucigenia give us only a glimpse of the wild experimentation happening in evolution's early chapters. Its shape doesn't follow any modern template. There's no direct match for it alive today. And yet, it left its mark etched into shale, whispering of a time when nature was still trying to figure out what an animal could even be. In the end, Hallucigenia is more than just a curiosity. It's a symbol of how complex and unpredictable life has always been. Even with modern tools and decades of study, its full story remains out of reach. But its fossil, fragile and strange, still speaks. Not in answers, but in questions that stretch across millions of years. Anomalocaris, the Cambrian monster. Back in the Cambrian period, Anomalocaris managed to be both a top predator and a scientific riddle. Its name means unusual shrimp, a label that came from one of science's most persistent early mistakes. When its fossils were first discovered in the 19th century, no one realized they belonged to a single animal. Instead, its body parts were cataloged separately. A pair of spiny, grasping limbs was thought to be a shrimp, its circular mouth mistaken for a jellyfish, and its flexible, finned body dismissed entirely. It wasn't until the 1980s that paleontologists finally realized these fragments all came from one animal, and what they had actually uncovered was the earliest known apex predator. Anomalocaris lived over 500 million years ago during the Cambrian explosion, a time when animal life began to evolve in complex and varied forms. It was massive compared to other sea life of the time, with some species reaching up to a meter in length, unthinkably large, in a world of mostly soft-bodied creatures no bigger than a thumb. It swam with undulating lobes along its sides, rippling them like wings to move with surprising speed and control. For an environment that lacked vertebrates, Anomalocaris was fast, flexible, and armed with tools that nothing else could match. Its most distinctive features were the two large appendages at the front of its head, curved and spiked like serrated tongs. These limbs could flex and snap forward, seizing prey and pulling it toward its mouth. That mouth, once mistaken for a jellyfish, sat beneath the head like a rotating ring of hardened plates. At first glance, it resembled a pineapple slice, with sharp, overlapping segments that could crush and tear. For years, scientists assumed it used this structure to crack open trilobites and other shelled prey, but further study showed something strange. The mouth likely wasn't strong enough to crush hard shells. Instead, it may have targeted soft-bodied animals, grabbing and slicing rather than smashing. With compound eyes unlike anything seen before, it hunted with deadly precision. Anomalocaris had some of the most advanced vision of its time, with large, stalked eyes covered in thousands of tiny lenses. These compound eyes gave it a wide field of view and the ability to detect movement in dim underwater light. In 2011, scientists discovered exceptionally preserved eyes in fossil beds from South Australia, showing that some species of Anomalocaris had up to 16,000 lenses per eye, more than most insects today. This visual ability would have given it a serious advantage over slower, less aware animals drifting in the Cambrian seas. Oddly enough, this apex predator lacked the one thing most of its prey had: armor. Its body was soft and flexible, tapering to a tail fan that likely helped steer it as it moved. It wasn't built for brute force, but for agility and speed traits that let it rise to the top of its food web. In this way, it marked a shift in ancient ecosystems. Predators were no longer passive feeders or ambush crawlers. They were now active, mobile hunters, capable of tracking and overwhelming their prey. Its presence tells us that by the Cambrian period, the arms race between predator and prey had already begun. While trilobites were evolving defensive spines and thicker shells, creatures like Anomalocaris were developing sharper limbs, keener senses, and more efficient ways to kill. The marine world was becoming more dangerous, and survival demanded innovation. Even after decades of research, Anomalocaris still holds secrets. Some fossils suggest it had a segmented brain with features resembling those of modern arthropods, hinting at its distant relationship to creatures like crabs and insects. Others show fine details of its feeding appendages, revealing how the tips may have curled inward to better grasp slippery prey. Still, no fossil has ever preserved its full body in perfect detail, and there are questions about how it reproduced, how long it lived, and how exactly it fit within the evolutionary tree. For all its mysteries, one thing is certain: Anomalocaris was one of the first creatures to truly dominate its environment. It patrolled the seas not with brute strength, but with a combination of speed, precision, and design unlike anything that had come before. In the silent, silt-filled oceans of the Cambrian, it was a monster not in myth, but in motion. And though its bones have long since dissolved, its legacy remains locked in stone, a glimpse into the moment when life first learned how to hunt. The giant millipede Arthropleura. Like a train made of armor plates, it glided across the ground, every segment moving in a coordinated wave. Arthropleura was not only the largest millipede that ever lived, it was one of the largest land invertebrates in Earth's history. Measuring up to 2.6 meters in length, it dwarfed anything else crawling through the dense undergrowth of the Carboniferous period, over 300 million years ago. The forests it wandered through were alien compared to what we know today. Towering club mosses and giant ferns dominated the landscape, their roots plunging into swampy soil, their leaves trapping moisture and keeping oxygen levels unusually high. Some scientists believe the atmosphere at the time had over 30% oxygen, much more than today's 21%, a condition that may have allowed Arthropleura and other arthropods to grow to such enormous sizes. In this oxygen-rich world, the creature's segmented body glided over rotting leaves and tangled roots, a quiet but massive presence in a forest that teemed with strange life. Though it looked intimidating, Arthropleura wasn't a hunter. Fossil evidence suggests it was a herbivore, likely feeding on decaying plant material, soft leaves, and mosses. Its mouthparts were adapted for slicing and grinding, not for hunting or piercing, and its size may have helped it avoid becoming prey rather than chasing it. With so few large land predators at the time, this millipede-like giant could roam relatively unbothered, carving paths through vegetation and perhaps shaping parts of its ecosystem simply by walking through them. Tracks left behind by Arthropleura have been found across what are now parts of Europe and North America. Some fossilized footprints are so large and clear that scientists can estimate their walking speed and stride length, offering rare insight into how they moved. These trackways, often preserved in ancient riverbeds or fine mud, show a body that hugged the ground closely, legs moving in waves from front to back. They tell of a creature that wasn't fast, but steady, confident in its place, and likely without many natural threats. Its body was composed of rigid plates that overlapped like roof shingles, protecting it from above while allowing flexibility beneath. This design, common among arthropods, gave it a mix of strength and mobility. But while millipedes today have rounded, almost soft-looking bodies, Arthropleura looked more like a tank, its sides flared, its segments wide and flat. Each leg possibly numbering in the hundreds moved in a tight sequence that would have created a wave-like motion along the body, making its passage both strange and strangely hypnotic to imagine. What we know of Arthropleura comes mostly from partial remains and trace fossils. Complete specimens are rare, in part because their bodies were made of material that didn't always preserve well, especially in drier environments. However, in 2021, a nearly complete exoskeleton was discovered in northern England, an extraordinary find that allowed scientists to study its size and structure more precisely. The fossil was so well preserved that the creature's outer armor had remained intact for over 300 million years, protected inside a sandstone boulder until it was revealed by chance when the rock split open. Eventually, this giant vanished from the fossil record. By the early Permian period, Arthropleura was gone. One likely reason is the decline in atmospheric oxygen, which dropped significantly over time and may have made it harder for such large invertebrates to survive. Another factor may have been the rise of vertebrate predator creatures with jaws, speed, and more efficient lungs who could challenge giants that had once moved without fear. As forests changed and ecosystems shifted, the world that had supported Arthropleura simply stopped making sense for it. The thought of such a giant moving low and silent through ancient undergrowth lingers in the imagination. It forces us to rethink what prehistoric life looked like, not just in the oceans or in the age of dinosaurs, but in the overlooked chapters of deep time, where insects and arthropods briefly held the throne. Arthropleura reminds us that long before claws and fangs ruled the land, power could come in the form of patient movement, low to the ground, armored in silence. Its story is written not in bones, but in footprints pressed into stone by a creature that didn't chase or fight, but simply endured until the world moved on without it. The early jawless fish, pioneers of the vertebrates. Once, the idea of a backbone was a radical new development. Long before fish had jaws, fins, or teeth, a strange group of creatures swam slowly through Earth's ancient sea, small, soft-bodied, and almost featureless, except for one thing: a notochord, the flexible rod that would one day evolve into the spinal columns of every vertebrate on Earth. These were the early jawless fish, and though they looked simple, they were the first of their kind, the pioneers of a body plan that would change the world forever. Their fossils are rare and delicate, found mostly in sediments from the Cambrian and Ordovician periods, more than 480 million years ago. One of the earliest known examples, called Millipede, came from the Chengjiang deposits in China and measured just a few centimeters long. It had no eyes, no bones, and no jaws. But what it did have was a head-like front, a muscle-lined body, and a thin fin running along its back, hints of the structure that would shape every vertebrate to come, from fish to humans. These ancient swimmers didn't bite or chew. Instead, they are likely fed by filtering tiny particles from the water or by scraping algae from surfaces using a flexible, toothless mouth. Some species had a circular opening that worked like a suction cup, allowing them to attach to surfaces or feed on soft matter. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and in the low-competition world of the early Paleozoic, that was enough to survive and spread. the Ordovician period saw an increase in both their diversity and complexity. New groups like the ostracoderms appeared, covered in bony armor and shaped like flattened tadpoles. Their heads were often shielded by heavy plates, giving them a level of protection that earlier species lacked. These armored jawless fish didn't swim with speed or grace, but their solid bodies helped them resist predators and navigate shallow, silty environments where soft-bodied animals might not survive. In some ways, they seemed like evolutionary experiments. One group, called heterostracans, developed large, flat-head shields and narrow, tapered tails suited for scooping along the sea floor. Another, the anaspids, had more streamlined bodies and multiple gill openings, suggesting more active swimming. None had jaws, none had paired fins, but each brought the vertebrate body a step further down a path it had never taken before. The bony plates of these fish are among the first examples of mineralized tissue in vertebrates. That may not sound important, but it was a major turning point. Once bone-like material began to form, evolution had something new to work with, something strong, flexible, and capable of growing in complex shapes. This opened the door to everything from skulls and spines to armor and teeth. It's hard to overstate just how important that first step was, even if it came in the form of a slow, jawless grazer, with little more than a tail and a thickened head. Many of these species likely lived near the bottom, staying close to the seafloor where food was easier to find and predators were fewer. Others may have drifted in the water column, their bodies stiffened just enough by internal cartilage to keep them upright. They couldn't outswim much, but they didn't have to. At the time, the sea was filled with strange, soft-bodied creatures and only a few fast hunters. Speed wasn't yet a requirement. Survival was about endurance and innovation. Sooner or later, they would be replaced. By the late Silurian and early Devonian, the first jawed fish had arrived, with stronger bodies, better mobility, and new ways to feed. These newcomers began to outcompete their simpler relatives, pushing many jawless species toward extinction. Only a few survived, and today, their distant descendants live on as hagfish and lamprey, strange, eel-like creatures that still lack jaws but carry echoes of a time when vertebrates were just beginning. Compared to the dramatic fossils of predators and armored beasts, theirs are easy to overlook. They don't inspire fear or awe, but they tell one of the most important stories in the history of life. Without these early jawless fish, the road to vertebrates might never have been paved. Everything with a spine, every mammal, bird, reptile, or amphibian traces its lineage back to these quiet trailblazers. In their simple forms, we find the roots of complexity, and in their shadows, we see the outlines of what was still to come. The first tetrapods, from water to land. Somewhere in the murky shallows of a Devonian swamp, around 375 million years ago, a fish lifted its head above the surface and pulled in air. That simple act, taking in oxygen not through gills but through lungs, marked one of the most important shifts in the history of life. These weren't ordinary fish. They were the first tetrapods, and they were about to leave the water behind. The journey didn't happen all at once. Before they ever stepped onto land, these early animals lived in transitional environments, coastal lagoons, riverbanks, and floodplains, where dry ground was never far away, but never fully safe either. In these places, fins began to change. Over millions of years, the strong, fleshy lobes that once helped fish push along the bottom evolved into limbs with bones that resemble a simple version of what we'd later call arms and legs. It wasn't just about walking. It was about pushing, lifting, and balancing, adapting to gravity, and learning to move where water couldn't carry them. What little the fossil record shows us is enough to trace the shift. One of the most famous early tetrapods is Tiktaalik rosier, discovered in the Canadian Arctic in 2004. It lived around 375 million years ago and had features of both fish and land animals. It had gills and scales, but also a flat head with eyes on top and strong, jointed fins with bones that formed a shoulder, elbow, and even a primitive wrist. Tiktaalik couldn't walk on land in the way later tetrapods would, but it could likely prop itself up in shallow water or on muddy banks, lifting its body just enough to peer above the surface or move through thick vegetation. Other early tetrapods, like Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, appeared shortly after. Their skeletons show even more developed limbs, with digits fingers and toes that hinted at the ability to push forward across uneven surfaces. Yet they were still very much tied to the water. Acanthostega, for example, had limbs with 8 digits, but its bones were too weak to support its full body on land. It likely used its legs to paddle through dense aquatic plants or anchor itself in flowing streams. Ichthyostega was stronger, with more robust limbs and a spine capable of supporting weight, but it still had features like a tail fin and internal gills that made it better suited for water than dry land. These animals didn't leave the water because it was easy. They were pushed by predators, by competition, or by the search for food and shelter. Shallow, oxygen-poor waters may have favored those with lungs. Crowded habitats may have rewarded the ability to climb over roots or escape drying ponds. Evolution didn't plan the move to land. It simply followed whatever worked. And for these early tetrapods, movement toward land opened up a world no vertebrate had ever touched. Breathing air was only one of many challenges. Gravity pulled harder out of water, so bones had to grow thicker. Limbs needed joints that could bend and brace. Skins had to resist drying out, and senses had to adjust to light, sound, and smell in a whole new medium. None of this happened overnight. The shift from fish to amphibian took tens of millions of years and included countless dead ends. But each adaptation added another step toward life on land. It's important to understand that the earliest tetrapods were not the ancestors of reptiles, birds, or mammals, nor were they directly. They were a separate group, early amphibians that opened the door for others to walk through. Some stayed close to water, returning to it often to lay eggs or find safety. Others moved further from the shoreline, slowly evolving lungs that worked better, legs that reached farther. Over time, a few of their descendants would cut the final tie to water and begin the next chapter. True land vertebrates, with eggs that didn't need to float and lungs that could breathe even the driest air. The footprints they left behind, some pressed into ancient mud long before bones ever fossilized, show creatures with wide splayed legs and heavy bodies dragging through shallow pools. They weren't fast or graceful, but they were first. And in their slow, uncertain movement, we find the moment life stood up and took its first steps away from the water. Not with a leap, but with effort, trial, and persistence. Every step sins. Every hoofbeat, pawprint, and footfall can be traced back to them. The strange case of Opabinia. Nothing else has ever looked quite like it. When scientists first studied the fossil of Opabinia, they weren't sure whether to laugh or question everything they thought they knew about early life. It had 5 eyes sitting on top of its head, a long, flexible snout that ended in a claw, and a soft, segmented body with swimming flaps along its sides. At a glance, it seemed like something imagined rather than real. But Opabinia was no illusion. It was a real creature that lived over 500 million years ago during the Cambrian period. Its remains were first discovered in the early 20th century in the Burgess Shale of British Columbia, a fossil site famous for preserving soft-bodied animals in fine detail. Yet even with such well-kept specimens, no one could quite make sense of Opabinia at first. It didn't match any modern animal group. Its body didn't follow the rules of insects, worms, or fish. For years, researchers struggled to figure out which side was the top, which end was the head, and how it might have moved or eaten. The confusion only deepened when it was shown to the public. In 1972, paleontologist Harry Whittington gave a presentation on Opabinia at a scientific conference. When he revealed its reconstruction 5 eyes, a backward-facing mouth, and a long tube-like snout. The audience reportedly laughed. It was just that strange. But the science behind it was solid, and what seemed ridiculous at first glance eventually became one of the most iconic examples of early evolutionary experimentation. Its body measured around 7 centimeters long, though some specimens were smaller. Along each side were rows of lobes that probably helped it swim, rippling like the fins of a cuttlefish. At the back, a fan-shaped tail may have given it extra thrust or helped with steering. But its most defining feature was the flexible proboscis, a tube-like extension from its head that ended in a set of grasping pincers. This snout wasn't just for show. It was likely used to grab food from the seafloor and pass it back to its mouth, which curiously opened underneath the head and faced backward. What it ate is still debated. Some believe it fed on soft-bodied animals or organic debris scattered across the ocean floor. Others think it might have picked through sediment, using its clawed snout to sift and search. Its 5 eyes, raised on short stalks, would have given it a wide range of vision, useful in a time when most creatures lacked sophisticated sight. Those eyes likely helped it detect movement from predators or prey. Although with no known hard defenses, its best tactic may have been escape. Classifying Opabinia has never been easy. It doesn't cleanly fit into any modern group, though some researchers place it among the stem arthropods, searly relatives of insects, spiders, and crustaceans. Others think it belongs in its own extinct branch entirely. What's clear is that it represents a moment in evolutionary history when life was still experimenting with what a body could be. Limbs, eyes, feeding tools, nothing had settled into familiar forms yet, and creatures like Opabinia were proof of that wild diversity. The Burgess Shale, where Opabinia was found, offers a rare look at this time. Most fossil sites don't preserve soft-bodied animals well, but here, the fine mud and lack of oxygen froze these ancient creatures in incredible detail. Alongside Opabinia were other bizarre life forms, like Hallucigenia and Anomalocaris, each just as puzzling in their own way. Together, they reveal a Cambrian world full of surprises, where natural selection was still testing limits. Opabinia is more than a fossil, it's a reminder that evolution isn't always straightforward. Its strange mix of traits, primitive yet specialized, suggests it came from a time when evolution hadn't yet committed to a single plan. The 5 eyes alone are difficult to explain, and the snout with its clawed tip has no direct modern comparison. It stands as a reminder that not every successful design has to last forever. Some creatures appeared, thrived for a time, and disappeared, leaving behind only questions in stone. What fascinates us about Opabinia isn't just its odd shape, it's what it represents. A branch of life that took its path, however briefly. A body plan that no longer exists, but once worked well enough to survive in a competitive, unfamiliar sea. In its quiet way, Opabinia speaks to the creativity of nature and the deep strangeness of our beginnings. The laughter that once met its discovery has long faded, replaced by something else entirely. Respect for just how unpredictable life can be. Spriggina, the first hunter? Flat and featureless, it lacked the basic snow face, no limbs, just a curious kind of symmetry. Yet Spriggina, an animal from over 550 million years ago, continues to puzzle scientists with one big question. Was this the planet's first predator? Found in the Ediacaran rocks of South Australia, Spriggina predates the Cambrian explosion, existing in a world just beginning to experiment with complex body plans. And though we may never know exactly what it did, the hints it left behind suggest it was more than just another soft-bodied crawler. Spriggina broke the mold. Its body had structure, symmetry, and a forward-facing design. Its body was segmented, but the segments weren't identical from end to end. They got smaller near the rear, and at the front sat a horseshoe-shaped structure that might have been a primitive head. This alone sets it apart from other organisms of its time, which were often radially symmetrical or lacked any obvious front or back. That single difference, having a defined front, suggests movement, decision-making, and possibly even a kind of hunting. Geologist Reg Sprigg first uncovered its fossils in the 1940s, and the creature now bears his name. Found in the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, the impressions left by Spriggina are preserved in ancient sandstone, where the soft-bodied creature pressed against the ocean floor long before skeletons were common. Measuring around 3 to 5 centimeters long, it wasn't large. But size doesn't always determine importance. What made Spriggina notable was its form, flattened but streamlined, segmented yet organized, as if built for a purpose beyond simply lying still. Many scientists have wondered whether Spriggina might have been related to later animals like annelid worms or even early arthropods. Some reconstructions show it with simple legs underneath, even though those structures haven't been preserved in the fossils we found so far. Others argue it may have moved with the help of muscles beneath its flexible body, sliding across microbial mats that covered the seafloor. If that's true, then it wasn't just moving, it was moving with intent, possibly searching for food. The idea that Spriggina was a hunter isn't universally accepted, but it isn't far-fetched either. Its head-like front might have housed sensory organs, maybe eyes, maybe antennae, though no such parts have been preserved. The forward-facing design and possible mobility suggest an animal capable of tracking something, even if only in a simple way. And in an environment filled with stationary or slow-moving creatures, anything with even basic direction and movement would have had a huge advantage. The Ediacaran period was a time of strange life. Most organisms were soft, flat, and passive, absorbing nutrients through their skin or feeding on mats of bacteria. Very few showed signs of predation. But if Spriggina was an early hunter, it may represent the beginning of a biological arms-race evolutionary pressure that would later lead to shells, armor, speed, and new ways to survive. The moment one creature started chasing another, everything changed. That possibility makes Spriggina important, even if its anatomy remains unclear. It may have marked a shift in behavior, not just in body structure, a change from surviving in place to surviving by motion, from absorbing to pursuing. And while the fossil record of the Ediacaran is thin, every discovery adds weight to the idea that animals like Spriggina weren't just the background noise of evolution, they were the spark that lit the fuse. Some researchers argue that Spriggina may be an early ancestor of trilobites or other Cambrian animals with defined heads and bilateral symmetry. Others caution that without harder body parts, much of its true structure might be missing. We may never know whether it had legs, jaws, or anything resembling modern anatomy. But the impression it made, literally pressed into stone, is enough to suggest a creature unlike most of its peers. What Spriggina really represents is possibility. It reminds us that long before skeletons, eyes, or claws, something was already stirring in the soft mud of ancient seas. Something that moved toward rather than away. Something that might have seen, hunted, or chosen a path. In the quiet world of the Ediacaran, Spriggina may have been the first to break that silence, not loudly, but with purpose. And that first move, small as it was, may have changed everything that came after. The Carboniferous forest giants. They rose in silence, towering above the swampy ground, their trunks straight and unbranching until they exploded into crowns of narrow leaves high above. In the Carboniferous period, roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, Earth's land was dominated not by animals, but by plants, and not the kinds we see today. These were giants. Club mosses as tall as buildings, horsetails as thick as tree trunks, and ferns that stretched into the canopy like slow-moving kings. What made these ancient forests so different wasn't just their size, it was the kind of plants that built them. Most of today's tall trees are seed-bearing, but back then, spores ruled the land. The giants of the Carboniferous, like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, were actually enormous relatives of the small club mosses we now consider ground cover. These strange trees had bark-like outer layers, covered in diamond-shaped patterns where leaves once grew. Inside, their trunks were filled with soft tissue instead of dense wood, making them grow fast, but limiting how long they could stand. Much of the land these plants covered was swampy and low, with rivers that shifted and flooded often. When these trees died, their waterlogged remains didn't fully decay. Instead, layer after layer of dead plant matter built up in the soil, creating thick peat beds. Over millions of years, and under pressure from sediment and heat, these beds turned into coal. That's why much of the coal mine today comes from this period. The Carboniferous was quite literally the time when the planet banked its first vast energy reserves. Below the towering canopy, the forest floor was dark, wet, and packed with life. Seed ferns, with their large fronds and woody stems, filled in the undergrowth. Horsetails of the genus Calamites grew in dense stands, their jointed, segmented stems stretching several meters high. The air would have been humid and heavy, thick with oxygen possibly as high as 35%, far above today's 21%, making the forest not only lush but also dangerously flammable. Fungi also played a massive role in recycling dead plant material, forming one of the earliest complex decomposer networks on land. That elevated oxygen level had a strange effect. It allowed animals, especially arthropods, to grow to massive sizes. Millipedes like Arthropleura stretched several feet long, crawling through leaf litter like armored buses. Dragonfly relatives such as Meganura flew overhead with wingspans wider than a hawk's. These creatures were not predators of the forest giants, but they thrived in the shelter of their roots, trunks, and towering leaves. Reproduction for these trees wasn't like what we see today. Without seeds or flowers, most relied on spores that drifted through the air or were carried by water. Rain and seasonal flooding were crucial for spreading new generations. Because of this, Carboniferous forests stayed close to water. They stretched across the equator in wide, swampy belts where the land stayed wet year-round. Near the end of the Carboniferous, the planet cooled. Sea levels dropped, swamps dried up, and the once vast rainforests began to fragment. This event, sometimes called the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, had a huge effect on both plant and animal life. Many of the giant club mosses and horsetails went extinct. The spore-based plants gave way to seed-bearing onostries more suited to drier, varied environments. And with the fall of the giants, new ecosystems rose to take their place. Yet their legacy remained. The coal they left behind fueled the rise of human civilization millions of years later. Their towering presence laid the groundwork for the forests we know today, even if the species is long gone. And their impact on the atmosphere helped shape the evolution of terrestrial animals in ways we're still trying to understand. When we dig deep into the earth and pull out ancient black rock, we're uncovering more than just fuel. We're holding the compressed remains of a forest world that no longer exists, zone of towering plants, colossal insects, and strange green cathedrals where time moved slowly and roots reached deep into ancient mud. The Carboniferous giants may have fallen, but in a way, they never really left. They're beneath our feet, in the walls of our homes, and in the fire that warms us. Their story is still being told. Dimetrodon, the apex predator before the fall. Towering above the brush, its narrow sail shimmered in the morning light, swaying gently with each step across the Permian earth. Long before the first dinosaurs ever appeared, Dimetrodon reigned as one of the top predators on land. It lived roughly 295 to 272 million years ago, stalking riverbanks and floodplains in what is now North America and parts of Europe. With its powerful jaws, sharp teeth, and distinctive sail, it has become one of the most recognizable creatures of the pre-dinosaur world, but also one of the most misunderstood. Reptilian in form but not in category, Dimetrodon wasn't a dinosaur at all. In fact, it wasn't even a reptile in the modern sense. It belonged to a group called synapsid sentient vertebrates, more closely related to mammals than to any lizard or crocodile. This lineage eventually gave rise to true mammals, though that path would take tens of millions of years to complete. Still, when you look at Dimetrodon, you're looking at a distant cousin, a creature that shared a common ancestor with us long before anything resembling a warm-blooded animal existed. Dimetrodon's strength lay in the sprint, not the chase-low, muscular form built for sudden motion. Most adults measured around 3 meters in length, though some species grew larger. Its limbs splayed outward in a sprawling stance, similar to a modern lizard, but its posture and gait were more advanced than the fully belly-dragging reptiles of earlier times. What really drew attention, however, was the sail on its back, a tall ridge, supported by elongated spines that grew out of its vertebrae. Covered in skin and possibly blood vessels, this sail has been the focus of speculation for decades. One idea is that the sail helped regulate body temperature. By turning toward or away from the sun, Dimetrodon may have been able to warm up in the morning or cool down in the heat of the day. Another theory is that the sail played a role in communication, flashing colors during mating season, warning rivals, or helping individuals recognize each other in the thick vegetation. Whatever its purpose, the sail was more than decoration. It was a key feature of a creature built for control and dominance in its environment. Its teeth added another layer to that role. Dimetrodon had 2 distinct sets of teeth-sharp canines at the front for grabbing and tearing, and shearing teeth further back for slicing meat. This arrangement, known as heterodonty, is common in mammals but rare in reptiles. It gave Dimetrodon a serious advantage as a carnivore, allowing it to handle a variety of prey. Fish, amphibians, and smaller synapsids all likely fell victim to its bite. Fossil evidence even shows that Dimetrodon may have scavenged, feeding on carcasses when the opportunity arose. The ecosystem it ruled was harsh and changeable. The Permian world was moving toward drier climates, and lush forests were being replaced by scrubby plains and deserts. Water sources became seasonal, and temperatures swung between extremes. In this world, Dimetrodon was perfectly adapted, a predator with strong legs, a powerful body, and jaws that could crush bone or tear muscle with ease. It sat at the top of the food chain not by luck, but by design. Over time, the dominance of Dimetrodon and its relatives began to wane. As new forms of life evolved, more efficient herbivores, faster competitors, and eventually, the archosaurs that would lead to dinosaurs, the world began to shift again. By the late Permian, Dimetrodon had vanished, replaced by other synapsids better suited to the changing environment. And not long after, the worst mass extinction in Earth's history wiped the slate nearly clean. But even after it vanished, its legacy kept echoing. The fossils of Dimetrodon tell us about a time when mammals' ancient ancestors were the rulers of the land, not the shadows beneath dinosaur feet. It shows that evolutionary success doesn't always look familiar. Before feathers, before horns, before roars echoed through the Jurassic, a sail-backed hunter was watching from the reeds. What survives of Dimetrodon is more than bones and teeth. It's the memory of a world before the world we know. A reminder that even the top predator can vanish, and that dominance is always temporary in the eyes of time. Yet for a brief chapteron written in sun, sand, and sail, Dimetrodon was king. Lystrosaurus, the survivor of Earth's deadliest extinction. At first glance, it didn't seem built to last. With its short legs, barrel-shaped body, and blunt, tusked face, Lystrosaurus was anything but intimidating. It walked low to the ground, like a reptilian pig, and its toothless beak made it better suited to rooting up plants than escaping danger. But when the worst mass extinction in Earth's history wiped out nearly all life, Lystrosaurus didn't just survive, it dominated. For millions of years after the Permian-Triassic extinction, this odd, humble creature was everywhere. Before disaster struck, Lystrosaurus was already a successful genus. It lived during the late Permian and early Triassic periods, roughly 250 million years ago, in what was then the supercontinent of Pangaea. Fossils have been found in Africa, Antarctica, and Asia, showing just how far it had spread. But its real rise came after the Great Dying, a catastrophe so severe that it killed off around 90% of marine species and 70% of life on land. In the wake of this extinction, ecosystems collapsed, predators vanished, and empty niches opened up. Lystrosaurus moved into that void and thrived. We don't know exactly why it was so tough, but some features offer possible answers. Its body was simple but efficient. It had sturdy limbs that allowed it to dig, suggesting it may have been a burrower-in ability that could have protected it from the harsh conditions on the surface, like extreme heat, drought, or toxic air. Its diet also worked in its favor. As a herbivore, it could feed on the tough, low-growing plants that managed to survive the climate chaos. It didn't need to hunt, chase, or fight, just persist. There's also the possibility that Lystrosaurus could breathe more efficiently than many of its contemporaries. Some researchers believe its ribs and chest structure hint at a diaphragm-like muscle, which would have helped it survive in low-oxygen environments. After the Permian extinction, the atmosphere was thought to be unstable, possibly thinner and polluted by volcanic gases from massive eruptions in what is now Siberia. Many animals simply couldn't adapt to such hostile air, but Lystrosaurus may have been better equipped. It wasn't a specialized creature, and that may have been its greatest advantage. Where more complex animals failed, Lystrosaurus endured by being a generalist and rugged. It didn't rely on delicate food chains or narrow habitats. It was flexible, durable, and unassuming. And in the broken world left behind, that was enough. Fossil records show it accounted for up to 90% of all land vertebrates in some areas of the early Triassic, a staggering number that speaks to its near-total ecological takeover. Its appearance has often sparked curiosity. Despite looking like a reptile, Lystrosaurus was a Dicynodonta type of synapsid, which places it closer to mammals than to dinosaurs. It had two small tusks, likely used to dig or pull at vegetation, and a tough, keratinous beak for cropping plants. Some paleontologists think it might have had leathery skin, possibly like a modern rhino's, and a sprawling gait that made it well-suited to slow but steady travel across difficult terrain. The world it lived was still recovering. Forests were gone in many regions, replaced by scrubby plants and bare earth. Rivers ran through empty plains, and the skies carried the chemical fingerprints of a planet in shock. Predators were few, and competition was minimal. In this strange silence, Lystrosaurus thrived not by speed or strength, but by simply outlasting everything else. Life recovered, and with it came a wave of new forms. New species appeared, filling the gaps left by the extinction. The age of reptiles began to take shape, and with it came faster, more complex animals. Lystrosaurus, once the ruler of a shattered Earth, began to fade. It disappeared by the Middle Triassic, replaced by newer creatures better suited to the changed world. But its moment had already made history. Lystrosaurus isn't just remarkable for surviving, it's remarkable for outlasting nearly everything else. In the most brutal chapter of Earth's biological story, it held on while most others vanished. And in doing so, it helped keep ecosystems alive during a time when they were on the brink of total collapse. It reminds us that survival isn't always about being the fastest or strongest. Sometimes, it's about being just tough enough, just adaptable enough to carry on when nothing else can.